It is the spring of 1941, and a German Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot is banking his Heinkel He 111 over the English countryside at roughly 6,000 meters. Below him, the patchwork quilt of rural Britain rolls past, fields stitched together by hedgerows, the occasional village clustering around a church spire, and here, on the fringes of the Chiltern Hills, a dense wood. It is, by every visible measure, unremarkable. Trees crowd together in the familiar pattern of an English copse. Shadows pool between the canopies. A dirt track winds along one edge before disappearing into farmland. The pilot tilts his camera housing, captures his frames, and banks away northward. There is nothing here worth bombing. Nothing, as far as any rational analysis of that photograph would suggest, worth a second glance. The photographs reach the Luftwaffe intelligence offices within days. Analysts study them with the meticulous care of men who know that a single missed detail might cost the Reich dearly. They note the wood. They note its edges, its density, the way it sits in relation to the roads nearby. They see trees. They move on. Beneath those trees, Britain is building something that will help win the war. What the pilot photographed, what the analysts dismissed, was not a forest at all. It was one of the most audacious feats of large-scale camouflage and deception ever attempted on British soil, a constructed landscape, engineered from paint and canvas and steel and extraordinary human ingenuity, designed to conceal an entire industrial military complex from the eyes of a technologically sophisticated enemy. It covered dozens of acres. It employed hundreds of workers, and it succeeded so completely that for much of the war, the Germans appear to have had no reliable intelligence on what was happening beneath it. This is the story of how Britain learned to hide in plain sight, and why, in the desperate arithmetic of the Second World War, the ability to make something vanish was just as vital as the ability to make it fly, float, or fire. To understand why such an extraordinary structure was necessary, you have to understand the particular terror of the autumn and winter of 1940. The Battle of Britain had been fought and, by the skin of the RAF's teeth, won. But the Luftwaffe had not simply packed up and gone home. It had shifted tactics. Where daylight bombing raids had failed against fighter opposition, the Germans turned to night bombing, the Blitz, and with it came a new and existential problem for British industry. Factories could not simply be moved. The infrastructure required to produce aircraft, ammunition, military vehicles, and specialist equipment had taken years to build and could not be replicated quickly elsewhere. These facilities sat in fixed positions, connected to rail lines and road networks, drawing power from specific substations, employing workforces drawn from specific communities. They were, in the language of military strategists, fixed targets, and the Luftwaffe knew where many of them were. The Germans' intelligence picture of British industry was not perfect, but it was alarmingly good. Pre-war aerial surveys, commercially available maps, industrial directories, and the observations of agents, some real, most subsequently captured, gave them a working knowledge of where Britain made things. Rolls-Royce in Derby, the Supermarine Works near Southampton, the Bristol Aeroplane Company. These facilities had already been bombed, some of them severely. The Supermarine factory at Woolston and Itchen was devastated on September 26, 1940, nearly wiping out Spitfire production in a single raid. Britain could not afford to lose another facility like that, but it could not move them either. What it could do, what it had to do, was make them invisible. The Air Ministry and the War Office had been grappling with camouflage as a discipline since before the war began, but the ambitions had largely been modest. Paint schemes for aircraft, nets draped over gun emplacements, the disruption of roofline silhouettes that might betray a factory from altitude. What was now being contemplated was something far more radical, not the concealment of an object, but the replacement of reality with fiction at landscape scale. The question was not merely how to hide a factory, it was how to make the land itself tell a lie. The answer came from a combination of sources: theatrical designers, architects, landscape gardeners, film industry professionals, and military engineers, who were pulled together under the structures of organizations like the Camouflage Development and Training Center at Farnham Castle in Surrey. These were people accustomed to making things appear to be what they were not, and they brought to the problem of military deception the same creative rigor they had applied to stage sets and film locations. The specific challenge of hiding a large industrial installation, one that might cover 10, 20, or even 30 or more acres, required thinking about concealment from a bomber's eye view. At altitude, a factory revealed itself through several characteristic signatures: the geometric regularity of its roof lines, the glint of skylights, the shadows cast by large structures at low sun angles, the tracery of roads and rail lines converging on its entrance, and the distinctive thermal footprint that could, in certain conditions, be detected even through cloud cover. Each of these signatures had to be addressed. The solution that emerged was the construction of what can only be described as a false landscape, an entire fictional geography built on top of the real one. Over the roof of the target facility, a framework of steel and timber was erected, rising on stanchions above the actual roof line to create a canopy some 3 to 4 meters above the structures below. This framework was then covered with a combination of materials: wire netting stretched across the supporting structure, hessian and fabric panels painted in naturalistic colors, and, most remarkably, three-dimensional elements designed to create the visual texture of an actual woodland. The trees were not real, but from 6,000 meters they did not need to be. Frames of wire and lightweight timber were clad in fabric sculpted and painted to suggest the silhouette of oak, beech, and hawthorn. Sections were designed to simulate the seasonal variation of an English wood, a crucial detail because an image analyst looking at reconnaissance photographs over time would expect a genuine woodland to change its appearance across the months. Autumn colors had to be painted in. The bare, stick-like appearance of winter deciduous trees had to be replicated. Spring greening required its own palette of light, variegated greens applied in patterns that mimicked the uneven budding of real foliage. The scale of this undertaking was remarkable. Individual sections of the canopy were manufactured in workshops and then transported to site, where they were assembled like an enormous jigsaw puzzle across the framework above. The teams doing this work operated largely at night or in the early morning hours before reconnaissance aircraft were likely to be overhead. Tracking was done in sections so that at no point did the installation present the visual signature of a construction site, itself a target that would invite bombing. A construction site in 1941 Britain, surrounded by nothing, meant something was being built. A forest with some activity at its edges might simply be forestry. Roads leading to the facility required particular care. Tarmac roads glint in the low-angle sunlight of early morning and late afternoon in ways that hedgerows and field boundaries do not, and a converging pattern of roads leading to a single point is one of the clearest indicators of an important installation visible from altitude. The approach routes were treated with paint and textured surfacing to reduce their reflectivity, and in some cases the visual line of the road was interrupted by the application of camouflage patterns that broke its continuous appearance into segments that might read as field boundaries or farm tracks. Rail spurs, those short extensions of line built into factory grounds to accept deliveries of raw materials and dispatch finished goods, were perhaps the trickiest problem. Rail lines have an extremely distinctive double-line signature from above, and a rail spur ending in the middle of an otherwise unmarked area screamed "important installation" to any competent analyst. In some cases, these were physically moved or concealed beneath the canopy structure itself. In others, dummy extensions were constructed beyond the real terminus to suggest that the line continued on to some other, less interesting, destination. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The workforce required to maintain these installations was not small. The camouflage itself needed ongoing maintenance. Fabric deteriorated in the British weather, paint schemes faded or were altered by actual vegetation growing up through and around the structure, and the seasonal repainting of the false canopy required regular attention. Teams of painters, fabric workers, and structural maintenance staff were employed on a semi-permanent basis at the larger sites. Their work was classified at a level that meant many of them did not fully understand what they were protecting or why. They were simply maintaining what appeared at close range to be an enormous and slightly baffling industrial art installation. The Germans, for their part, were not entirely without camouflage capabilities of their own. They had invested significantly in the concealment of U-boat pens, airfields, and industrial facilities, and the Luftwaffe's reconnaissance arm, the Aufklärungsgruppen, employed skilled photographic analysts. But the British camouflage effort had a quality the Germans struggled to match in this context. It was driven by professionals who understood, intuitively, how the human eye and brain reconstruct meaning from incomplete information in an aerial photograph. A photograph taken at altitude is not a map. It is a collection of tonal values and shadows from which a trained analyst must reconstruct a three-dimensional reality. The British camouflage designers understood this. They were not trying to fool the camera. They were trying to fool the person looking at the photograph, and they designed their deceptions accordingly, paying attention not just to the colors and textures visible from above, but to the shadows those fake trees would cast, and ensuring those shadows behaved as the shadows of real trees would behave at the latitude and season in question. The Americans, who arrived in Britain in significant numbers from 1942 onwards, had their own camouflage doctrine developed partly in response to peacetime industrial accidents and partly from the experiences of their forces in North Africa. Their approach tended towards the extensive use of garnished nets, large panels of netting festooned with strips of fabric or vegetation to break up outlines, and the disruption of geometric roof patterns with paint. Both approaches were effective, but they operated at smaller scale and with less ambition than the full landscape replacement being attempted at the most sensitive British sites. The American approach could hide a gun emplacement or a fuel dump. The British approach was trying to make a factory disappear from the map entirely. The Germans did on occasion attempt something similar. The massive industrial complex at Luna, which produced synthetic oil vital to the German war effort, was subject to elaborate camouflage, including the construction of dummy buildings, smoke screens, and attempts at false lighting to confuse night bombers about the true position of the facility. But the Luna camouflage, however ingenious, operated under the very different constraint of trying to defeat not just visual reconnaissance but repeated, sustained bombing raids by the USAAF and RAF, whose planners already knew roughly where the target was. Hiding something the enemy already knows exists is a fundamentally different problem from making them doubt it exists at all. That distinction is what made the British effort at sites like these so remarkable. The goal was not to protect a known target. It was to deny the enemy the knowledge that the target existed. The actual operational impact of these deceptions is inevitably difficult to quantify with precision. Post-war analysis of Luftwaffe targeting records and bomb damage assessments shows that certain facilities which should, by any rational enemy calculus, have been high-priority targets were either never bombed or were bombed significantly less than their industrial importance warranted. Whether this was entirely a result of successful camouflage, or whether other factors, changing strategic priorities, navigational difficulties, competing demands on the Luftwaffe, also played a role, remains a matter of debate among historians. What is documented is that some of the installations protected by the most sophisticated camouflage continued to produce throughout the war at rates that would have been impossible had they been subjected to the kind of sustained attack that destroyed facilities of lesser concealment. The psychological dimension should not be underestimated either. Knowing that your factory, your workers, your production line was concealed from the enemy provided a measure of operational certainty that was itself of value. Workers in a facility that had been bombed once lived with a specific kind of dread. Workers beneath a false forest could at least believe they were hidden. The lasting legacy of these camouflage installations operates on several levels. At the most immediate and practical level, the techniques developed during the Second World War, the understanding of how to construct deceptions that work against the specific cognitive apparatus of an aerial photo analyst, fed directly into the Cold War discipline of concealment and camouflage that both NATO and Warsaw Pact nations developed extensively in the decades that followed. The idea of landscape-scale deception, of replacing reality with a crafted fiction at the level of geography rather than individual objects, became a foundational principle of military installation concealment that persists, in adapted form, in contemporary military thinking about hiding facilities from satellite surveillance. At a broader cultural and historical level, the fake forests and false landscapes of wartime Britain represent something genuinely extraordinary about the national response to existential threat. Britain, in 1940 and 1941, was a country facing, with remarkable clarity, the possibility of defeat. What these camouflage installations represent is not simply military ingenuity, though they are certainly that, but a willingness to commit extraordinary human creativity and effort to the patient, meticulous, unglamorous work of making something invisible. There were no explosions involved, no medals for the painters who spent their nights applying autumn colors to wire-frame trees. The work was secret. The achievement was defined by its absence, by the fact that nothing happened, that the bombers went elsewhere, that the production lines kept running. Some evidence of these installations survives in the historical record, in the files of the Air Ministry Camouflage Directorate, in the papers of individual designers and artists who contributed to the effort, and occasionally in photographic archives where both the genuine aerial photographs taken by the Luftwaffe and the British records of what those photographs concealed can be placed side by side. The effect, when you look at them together, is quietly stunning. The analyst's photograph shows trees. The British file photograph shows a factory. The same coordinates, the same moment in history. Two entirely different realities. That is the thing to hold on to, as the story of the fake British forest settles into its proper place in the strange, brilliant, improvised history of a nation at war. Somewhere over the English countryside, a German pilot photographed some trees and flew on. Beneath those trees, the machines of British survival kept turning. The camouflage had done its job with such completeness that the evidence of success was, by definition, invisible. They built a forest that wasn't there, and the forest saved the factory, and the factory helped save Britain, and no one who flew over it ever knew they had seen anything at all.